Welcome to SNC's Power Up webinar on Resiliency, Weathering the Storm. My name is Spencer Zirkelbach, and I will be your host for today's webinar. And want to start off by saying thank you to everyone who has joined us here today. We have a wide range of attendees from utilities, both public power as well as investor-owned utilities, government agencies, regulators, and consultancies from around the world. Before we begin, I have a few administrative items to cover. First of all, the webinar is being recorded and a recording will be shared after the event along with a brief survey. We would greatly appreciate a few seconds of your time to provide feedback on today's content. Attendee microphones are muted and we have turned off the chat feature. If you have a question or a concern that comes up during the webinar, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to ask any questions you have, and we will address all those questions at the end. Finally, if you have any technical difficulties, you can also use the Q&A function and a member of the SNC team will help. Now that we have that out of the way, let me introduce our panelists who will be sharing their expertise with us today. Angie Schuler is a power systems leader with 20 years of experience helping utilities improve distribution system reliability. She is presently Vice President of Power System Solutions at SNC. Caleb Harrison started his career with a municipal utility and now helps customers plan, deploy, and grow their distribution automation systems as an SNC Automation Application Director. Finally, we are extremely pleased to be joined by Josh Winslow, who is the General Manager and CEO of Brunswick Electric Membership Cooperative. Josh is passionate about the role of electric cooperatives in our energy future and in developing a workforce prepared to meet the challenges of our evolving industry. Thank you to all of our panelists for sharing your time with us and this group today. Now I'm going to turn it over to Angie, who's going to kick us off on the rising challenges with storms. Angie.
Thank you, Spencer. At a time when the frequency of severe weather events is increasing across the globe and energy consumers are becoming more sensitive to the impact of power outages, utilities are paying extra attention on storm resilience planning and initiatives. In today's Power Up webinar, we'll be discussing the challenges of storm resiliency and then digging into how utilities are tackling these challenges. Our guest speaker, Josh Winslow, will share how Brunswick EMC has weathered recent storms and what their resilience planning involves. We also have a few polls put in here to gather input from everyone on today's call regarding their own journey on resiliency planning. All of this is to help you take control of your system hardening. Our first poll, we'd like to get a feel for what is the biggest storm concern in your region. It'll also give us some idea of where everyone is calling in from today. So you can see a poll show up on your screen. If you could just select which of the options is your biggest concern in your region. Is it hurricanes, ice and snow, mudslides, earthquakes, wildfires, floods? Please select the one. And as I see this list, it reminds me of a time last year around June. I was on a weekly field service call that we do to prep for the jobs in the upcoming week. We had one technician that was going to the southeast and there were hurricanes approaching. We also had a technician heading to California and there was a wildfire raging. We also had a technician going to the northwest where there was some civil unrest, and all of this was layered on top of the global pandemic that we were all going through. So there's no doubt that utilities are dealing with a lot to keep the lights on. So it looks like we've got our results in. Really the top two are hurricanes and then ice and snow. So we've got some northern attendees with the ice and snow and some hurricanes down in the southeast. So thank you. Interesting to see some of the feedback there, what the challenges are that you're dealing with. So let's dig into storm resiliency. One of the biggest challenges for a storm is that you can't do much until it's passed. The crews are just waiting, businesses are unable to operate, and customers are in the dark, getting madder by the minute. Though these major event days don't count towards your reliability metrics, they do have a major impact on customer satisfaction. So all of this together means the speed of restoration is essential. So since you can't do much during the storm itself, proper planning ahead of time is important. Let's look at the challenges from a people standpoint and getting everyone on board with your storm plans. As part of the plan, most everyone's job changes during major storms. So they need to be trained for this storm duty on top of their day jobs. It's also important to have a thorough storm response plan, which needs to be maintained. And people, in addition to their storm duty job, need to be trained on this response plan, and test the plan regularly is important as well. And often during large storms, your local crew is not enough. So even though you've trained your team, established a plan, your work still isn't done. It is critical to have a training guide for mutual aid crews that may come in so that they're readily available to get them up to speed as well. In addition to having people ready for the storm, the power system must be ready as well. There's a few aspects to consider when looking to make your power system more resilient. First, you want to look for ways to mitigate avoidable work. The longer it takes to repair, the longer the outage. And the more repair work, the more truck rolls. And truck roll costs during a major event are typically much higher than normal days. I've heard as high as 4 times a typical truck roll during a major storm event. And if you can mitigate avoidable work, it also allows you to focus on the critical repairs. And in addition to mitigating avoidable work, you want to minimize the damage. To do this, you need to have a clear idea of your system and what natural forces it will need to endure during the storm. So you want to assess the weak points in order to minimize this damage. And also, it's obvious, that if you can avoid this damage, it'll save you money on those repairs as well. And lastly, it is important to look for ways to restore power quickly. Because as we mentioned, customers are less tolerant, businesses are unable to operate, or maybe your essential loads are on backup generation, which often have limited capacity. So time is of the essence to get them back to grid power. And the region may be even in a state of emergency and in crisis mode. So getting the power restored quickly will help address some safety impacts to the community. Maybe they're dealing with you don't want them dealing with a long-term power outage in extremely cold temperatures. Or maybe it's important that you get the power back to your water pumps to help with the flooding. So taking into consideration the things to consider when looking for ways to harden your system, an interesting data point to consider is how many fuses do you typically replace after a major storm? So our second poll here is just asking, in a major storm event, how many fuses do you typically replace? And we do have an audience from different size utilities here, as Spencer mentioned, so we'll know this will vary, but we've got 4 different categories. Do you replace less than 500? Is it between 500 and 1,000 fuses, or maybe 1,000 to 2,500? Or are you replacing more than 2,500 fuses during a major storm event? So we've got some answers in all categories, but it looks like most of the responses are less than 500 fuses that are replaced. But we do have even up utilities that are replacing more than 2,500 during a major storm event. So as a follow-up question then to how many fuses are replaced, so out of those, what percentage then are just a simple refuse? What percent do you have to just go out there, replace the fuse, and no additional repair work is needed? My dad was a lineman, so I remember he loved the trips when he was on call, that he just had to go out there, replace the fuse, and get the customer's lights back on, because it was a quick trip. You'd turn around and be back home in no time at all. But now I think about it from a standpoint, it'd be great if you didn't even have to leave home and go and replace that fuse. So I'm interested to see what percentage is, out of the major storms, is it just a simple refuse without additional repair work? So we've got to get a split of our results. Looks like majority fall into that 26 to 50%, where it's just a simple refuse with no additional repair work. This is just a question to kind of get you thinking about ways to look at your system and to analyze it, to be able to look at how do you harden that system for storms and make it more resilient. So looking at this, if you could avoid those truck rolls, this could save you time and money, as well as getting the power back on for their customers quicker. I'll now turn it over to Caleb to talk about storm resiliency in action.
Thanks, Angie. So Angie was laying out some of the challenges that we encounter when we're facing, when we start looking at storm resiliency, right? But when we start looking at how do we prepare for storm resiliency, we really got to understand that 75% of the work that goes into preparing for that storm happens before the storm. Before the storm is where we can do all of our work to make sure that when the storm gets here, you know, we're hunkered down, we're ready to go. And then after the storm passes, everything becomes second nature. Things are rolling and we can get everything back on quicker. But getting that pre-work done before the storm happens is a huge component. And we kind of have three blocks that we've broken this up into. And the first one is training, right? So down here in the Southeast, part of my role, I visit with a lot of different utilities. But I've come from utilities up in Michigan, up north, and I can see differences between how utilities down in the Southeast prepare versus how utilities in the North start to prepare. One of those big ones is a storm plan. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the storm plan, what you have is you take everyone's normal roles, and then you think about when you're in storm mode, it's like an emergency management mode, that you might be an engineer today as your normal job function. You might move into a bird dog role where you're bringing crews from outside of town around, showing them the system so that way they can perform the work, because they don't know your system and your standards, right? So thinking about what kind of jobs might be important to have during that role. And that's something that a lot of our big customers and big users, big utilities down in the Southeast do a great job at having these storm response plans. And some of our smaller customers do too. If you're a muni or a co-op, you'll hear from Josh later at how that they have these storm response plans laid out. But one of the big things is, even if you have a plan, you need to go through and actually run through scenarios. Take a day, have a storm day, where everybody goes into their emergency management roles and they understand what the job duties are. That way you can find the weak points in those storm plans. If something doesn't work, the time to change it is before the storm happens. And along with that is mutual aid training, right? So if you have a major event, you're going to have mutual aid crews coming onto your territory. But what do we do for those mutual aid crews? So part of an example of that for mutual aid crews, when Florence came through, Hurricane Florence, that's something that you'll hear Josh talk about. He's my neighbor from across the river, so we experienced the same storm. But for me, my complete road, I live in Wilmington, North Carolina, my whole road was actually rebuilt by crews from Canada. So you have crews that aren't even from the same country coming in to help rebuild your system. And that's where it's important to go and not only take a look at your storm roles, storm jobs internally, but also what are you going to do for your mutual aid crews? So that could be something, not only do they not know your system and possibly not know your standards, they may also not know your equipment. You may have equipment on your system that they've never worked with before, they've never used. So it's important to create some, we'll call them cheat sheets, right? Just some simple laminated 8.5 by 11 quick operation guides for some of that equipment that other utilities may not be as familiar with as you are. The use of videos is also really important, and engage the manufacturer of that equipment. A lot of times, the manufacturer will actually have all of that material for you and can customize it for what your needs are. So that way, when these mutual aid crews come and it's after the storm and they want to hit the ground running, you have material that you can provide them to actually get them up to speed on your system, your equipment, and your standards. So the next block, and Angie touched on, is mitigating avoidable work. So when the storm comes through, right, you're going to have a lot of wind. Doesn't matter if it's an ice storm, if it's a hurricane, even when you look at floods and wildfires, you're going to have a lot of work that could be avoidable. So looking at things like, do we have our devices in the right locations? How far do we want to segment our customers? Because the more that we can use devices to segment the amount of customers, then the greater the chances are that we can get fewer customers out during that permanent outage, because they're able to reroute power and sectionalize down to a small number. I think most utilities that I've heard of that are on that leading edge are really working towards a 500 customers per segment device optimization goal. The next piece is focusing crews on critical repairs, right? So if you think about, Angie touched on fuses, and we'll go into this a little bit more, but if you're having to send, 10, 15, 20 different service crews just to replace fuses, well, that's not really focusing on critical repairs. That's onesie, twosie customers, just a handful of, nothing major, no permanent outage, but you're having to spend those critical resources on those type of tasks versus more high impact outages where you might have 1,000, 2,000 customers out. And then lastly is using automation and technology. We can kind of work on the first two, right? There's equipment out there and technology out there that we can use to mitigate avoidable work. So leveraging that as part of your storm resiliency plan in the pre-work before the storm hits. Perfect example is lateral reclosers. Lateral reclosers, they're going to go through, and they're actually, if you have a tree branch falls into the line, okay, that lateral recloser opens up, the tree branch falls in the clear. Now that fuse is going to automatically reclose with the lateral recloser, preventing you from having number one, a permanent outage, number two, the nuisance work. Right? You're not going to have to go send a crew. You're not going to have a customer who's out of power for hours while you get some of the bigger outages taken care of. That has been done automatically, refused, and now you don't have to spend 4 times your normal truck roll just to go out and take care of what's really nuisance work. Now those 10, 15 service crews, you may be able to cut that down to 1 or 2 service crews, and now the rest of them can go help with the larger storm response effort and an ability to get things back on quicker. And this applies to other types of automation. If we can sectionalize down to 500 customers and start rerouting power before the storm, as soon as the storm's done, well, now we know exactly where our focus areas need to be. We know the state of our system. We know where the bigger problems are, and we can spend the right resources on the right problems. And then lastly is minimizing damage, right? So if we can't reroute things, if we can't mitigate, then we can definitely minimize the amount of damage as part of our pre-work before the storm hits. So this is really broken up into 3 areas. You have grid hardening, whether you're going with stronger poles, if you're upgrading some of your actual pole hardware, or maybe doing as part of this grid hardening plan, might also be looking at some undergrounding. Looking at system assessments. What parts of our system are old? Where do we have 50-year-old poles that need to be replaced? Where do we need tree trimming in certain areas? That's all part of, before the storm gets here, making sure that we're ready and prepared. And we're going to minimize the amount of damage that any external factor could cause. And then also with that is undergrounding. And undergrounding is kind of an interesting one, because you hear undergrounding and your first thought is like, okay, that's a no-brainer. We're just going overhead to underground. If it's underground, can't be affected during a storm. Well, then you got to take a look. You really got to take a look at what are you undergrounding with. because when it comes to underground gear, it comes in different types. If you went overhead to underground, but you're using live front equipment or even dead front, but it's air insulated, and you live in a hurricane area or flood prone area, now we have a problem. Because if you're you did all that work to go overhead to underground, but it's all air insulated gear, if it floods, it's no longer serving its purpose as far as minimizing the amount of damage the storm can cause. So taking a look at things like SF6 or even the new solid dielectric insulating mediums, you can now start to prepare not only for what the storm will initially bring, but what the storm can bring afterwards as well. All three of these things work together to restore power quickly. So you have training, mitigating avoidable work, and minimizing damage. This is all before the storm. Next, we're going to hear from Josh Winslow, CEO of Brunswick Electric, down here in Southeast North Carolina, and he's going to walk us through what we can do once the storm has passed.
Thanks, Caleb. Before I get started, a quick reminder to monitor the, to use the Q&A function. We're going to be monitoring that and should lead to a lively discussion as those questions start coming in. So I'm going to apply some of the concepts that Angie and Caleb laid out by sharing some experiences that have led to positive outcomes for us here in the Southeast. And I'm going to do that at a pretty high level. Talk more about the aspects of a crisis management framework and some of the people and process pieces of that framework and how we react to an event. So if you look at your screen, you're looking at a stressor, an event that affects the grid. This is just a couple of years ago due to Hurricane Florence, some flooding at some pretty critical areas in the system. So before talk too much in detail, I'd like to level set the discussion on what the topic is, and that is resilience. And there's some very important but subtle differences in a lot of the words that we use in our industry when we describe our reaction to events. So resilience, redundancy, reliability, very different things when we describe an event. So if you could go to the next screen. Thank you. I like to think about resilience and reliability on this spectrum, on this continuum. This is from PNNL, and if you just look at the extremes, I won't get into the detail, but if you look at the extremes on the far right of your screen, the reliability domain, it's simple. It's a on or off, yes or no. Are we on? If we're not, we have to get it back on. As you move left, things become more complex. You start talking about absorption and mitigation, avoiding stressors. And if you think about it from different perspectives, from the utility perspective, being resilient leads to a perspective of the customer of being reliable. The customer has the perception of reliability when the utility is resilient. So in many ways, resilience is about what never happens, especially from a customer perspective. So next slide, please. A little background about the company I work for. This is our service territory in southeastern North Carolina. These are the recent named storms that have directly affected us. We have frequent weather events. The size of our system, we're about 100,000 meters, 7,000 miles of line. Over half of that is underground, and we have about 300 miles of transmission. We leverage quite a few technologies on our system that include distribution automation, a lot of solar plus storage, and some functional microgrids. Speaking of recent activity, Caleb and Angie both alluded to Hurricane Florence. A big event for Brunswick Electric. About 85% of our system was out, 142 poles replaced, about 80,000 feet of conductor replaced. And more recently, we had an EF3 tornado earlier this year that destroyed several transmission lines. So our discussion to this point has been kind of framed from three different domains: the ready domain, recovery, and then kind of rebuild. What do we do moving forward into the future? So I want to make a couple points on system philosophy and planning. So at a very high level, from a business perspective, it's very important for the organization to understand where their investments will go and what the philosophy is going to be on building the system and operating the system, and then articulating that to everyone. Because as we move down into details, let's say into your distribution engineer's philosophy on sectionalizing or mitigation, the culture is important. So designing with an eye to resilience, operations, designing with an eye to workability goes a long way in being resilient. Getting into more detail using the underground and overhead example that Caleb mentioned, there's really no free lunch in our business. There's always trade-offs. So the way that your underground system behaves is much different from a protection perspective than your overhead system. So especially for the younger or newer engineers, it's important that they understand from the organization what the philosophy is. And the most important point, I think in this discussion that I'll bring out is the importance of planning. And if you think about planning, what is it really? In my point of view is that the planning process is much more important than the actual plan. So planning is a mental construct of a lot of different things, a lot of different inputs, of the constraints you have, of the resources you have, of the threats that you may face, and the information or the experience that is held by some people and might not be held by all people. And when you add scenarios into your planning, you start to assign probabilities to things that might happen. Nothing is unanticipated. You're looking at the extremes. Just a quick example of how important that is. We had a tornado event where we lost radio communication and cell. So it's very unlikely, but somewhat anticipated. So when I approach planning, when our organization approaches planning, I think we keep these three outcomes in mind as successful goals for planning. One is staying completely organized throughout an event. The second is anticipating what might happen. And the third is that the plan is shared. Everyone in the organization can see it and they understand their role. So moving kind of into the response and adding recovery into that domain, I want to mention three kind of separate points. One is how important safety and security is. The second, what documentation does for your organization, and last, how decision-making changes. So having a framework in place that ensures organization will give you some things that are very important, especially as it relates to mutual aid. And that is safety of your workers and food and lodging security of all the workers. Because if those things are in place, the recovery effort is much more organized and it's much more efficient, leads to better outcomes. In a test we like to go through on our system is if we have visitors, if we have mutual aid, and I can tell you when any specific person arrived on our system, what they ate, what room they stayed in, who they worked with, what they worked with, when they left, I've been successful and we've been organized. So that's kind of our in-house test. And documentation can really help there. So moving to the next slide, I've captured a few screenshots. And the point I'd like to make here is that readily available there is software for visitor information and software for damage assessment on the market. So these are some older snapshots. On the left of your screen, some crew information from Hurricane Florence. In the middle, an assessment screen. From that screen, the damage is shown by a picture. There's the latitude and longitude, it's time stamped, and it's stamped by the person responsible. And leveraging this type of technology in the field, as you can see on the right, has tremendous gains in efficiency, especially post-storm event when you're really having to get things together to find out what happened. Last point on decision-making. If you think about your organization as having two separate time periods, one kind of normal operation, the other kind of crisis, the way decisions are made are different. You have a lot more command and control in normal operating. The power kind of shifts during crisis more to the operations engineering side. And it's very important to understand what those differences are in the planning process before an event. So at the extremes, in a very large, complex event, you're going to have some command level decisions to make, but you're going to need people that can make disparate decisions all over the system at a pretty high level. And so that's what we strive for in our organization, is leadership in the field and solid decision-making that's aligned with the organizational goals. So last slide, kind of leaving those two domains and moving to the rebuild domain. Can we build this back better than it was before? I think the most important thing we can be asking ourselves is, does our experience with events, does it lead to improvements on our system? And a way to do that is to have some sort of process to understand what we did right, what we did wrong. So a post-mortem type process. That post-mortem type process will reveal some goals for your organization. And those goals will lead to requirements. And for us, a lot of times those requirements lead to projects for mitigation. Maybe we can do something different and we can lessen the impact of a storm to our system. And we can achieve that perception of reliability from our customers. So an example of this, real world example, you're looking at a one line for a distribution automation scheme. So we serve a military base. And after a couple bad hurricanes, the military base had a goal to lessen the impact of outages on military operations. Simple goal, lessen the impact on operations on the military base. That led to a stakeholder group that really defined the requirements from a customer perspective. When do we need to be on? What can we ride through? And that resulted in the discussion of solutions. And for this project, the solution had to be technology-based because of the requirements. So after a pretty rigorous process, we decided on an IntelliTeam scheme utilizing Vista, pad-mounted gear, and a couple overhead reclosers at the delivery points. So that process, kind of that continuous improvement thought, leads to more capability on the system, more capable employees and processes, and then also more capable system from a technology perspective. And that capability leads to more resilience. So that's what I have prepared. I see that we are getting some questions, and Caleb, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Josh. So we've had 3 different panelists come speak with y'all today, and I'm a big list fan. So we've put together a checklist to kind of walk through storm resiliency and what you can do. So the first step is to be ready, right? Identify the risks, plan your execution, a storm plan, and then share that plan. Make sure your organization is aware of what the plan is, and make sure when people come to work for you as part of your organization that they'll also know what the plan is. The second step is for respond, right? Prepare storm kits for the crews. This is in the moment when the storm is bearing down. You're leveraging automation to make sure that we're minimizing damage and we're isolating that mitigatable work where we can. And then standard review process, that when that storm is there, making sure things are in place. When you get people on the ground, they know what's going to happen, that when they start to rebuild, that there's a process to review that as well. And then lastly, ready, respond, and rebuild. Food and lodging for our crews, documenting, what went where, how was it rebuilt, and then establishing that decision-making process like Josh mentioned, to make sure that there's a chain of command, that we know that everyone's taken care of and that we stay safe. So we thank you everyone for joining this. Spencer, I'll turn it back over to you and we'll go into our Q&A.
Awesome. Thanks, Caleb. And thanks, Josh and Angie, for sharing your insights on storm resiliency with everybody today. We've gotten a lot of questions, so But if you, as Josh had mentioned, if you had a question that came up, you can use the Q&A function, and I'll provide those as many as we can in the remaining 25 minutes we have here. But please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to submit your questions. We'll get to as many as we can. So with that, I'm going to start off with one. We kind of got a couple in the same theme. So I'm going to kind of group this together to say, from both a mitigating avoidable work and a minimizing downtime, seems like there's a lot of options for investment. And so there's a general question from a couple different people about what have you experienced to be the best place to start with that resiliency investment? Caleb, you want to start that off?
Yeah, I will. So we'll have a white paper shortly, so I won't spoil everything off the bat, but really for that question, it comes down to, I think the best formula that I've really seen is coming up with a way to level set all of these different projects against each other. So the specific metric is $1 per CMI saved. If you can figure out, how many customer minutes of interruption that you're saving over how many dollars it costs you to implement that one device or that program, now you come up with a metric that you can use to bias all of these different projects against each other. And then just the lowest dollar per CMI saved projects win, and you can kind of prioritize in that level.
Got it. Angie, Josh, anything else to add to that concept?
I would add, find out what benchmark data you have available as a metric. So depending on what type of organization you have, somebody's holding benchmark data. And I think the other tip would be to really understand your business objectives at a high level in the organization. So, how much you can spend on investment and see where things fit. Here in the Southeast, we do invest a lot in underground, but it's very expensive and comes with its own set of kind of operating challenges.
Excellent. Angie, I believe this one's directed towards you because I think you first mentioned the idea of avoidable work. And so there's a question of, what do you classify as avoidable work?
Yeah, I think the thing that pops in my mind is avoidable work is something that it was a temporary disruption. So if you could have the system hardened enough to withstand that, that would be avoidable. So the temporary tree branches coming into contact, causing those temporary outage or events, you want to mitigate those to becoming a permanent outage.
Josh, Caleb, anything else? Okay, excellent. So another question we have is, how do utilities compare preventative resilience measures to determine where to make their investments? So I think that's a little bit similar, but any to the last one we had, but anything more specific as far as I think to that post-mortem you were talking about, Josh, about how do you take a look at what you did and what you look at to take learnings from storms and apply it to future, as far as measuring the preventative resilience measures you put in place.
So, right, the kind of the post, what can we do better? What parts of our system would be impacted? And it helps after a storm event, but also throughout the year, our engineering group looks at blinks and temporary faults on the system and isolates those down to specific causes and then tries to mitigate those. I think, kind of an ongoing process throughout the year.
Angie, I think this one's towards you again, because I think you're the first one to mention, kind of getting everyone on the job trained. So any advice from, Angie or any of the other panelists on how to train internally? We talked about mutual aid training a lot, but there's also, how do you get your teams trained up internally? Things where you've seen that work. Angie, do you want to start with that?
Sure. I think the best training tools nowadays really is the videos. I think paper instructions have really gone to the wayside. If you could digitalize that into a video and training people on what they need to do. Josh talked a lot about the different technology there of recording all the work orders and assessments. Show a video of how people need to do that rather than an instruction on what you need to click on and how you need to do that. You used to take screenshots, write them into instructions. why not make a video now? I think that's the best approach on training these days with the technology on hand.
Josh, anything else to add to that, or Caleb?
I'd say when you overlap your engineers with your operations functions, you get better outcomes when it comes to crisis management. So if you take a lot of experience in the field and match that with some horsepower behind the computer, you can end up with a pretty solid system.
Another question kind of towards the training, but I think we'll start with you, Josh, is that you mentioned this idea of building a culture internally with an eye towards resilience, building towards that eye of resilience and the eye of reliability there. Can you talk a little bit about how you all incentivize that culture? You've talked about, overlapping operations and engineering, but how do you actually make that part of people's job responsibilities and goals?
Well, that's been embedded in the culture here, I guess, because of the location Southeast and the outage events. So I was kind of adopted into that culture. But I would say the direct discussions about resilience, so a review process with designs with the engineering team, and a real deliberate discussion on what are our contingencies if we have an outage here. How do we want this to operate? And having a big enough group of subject matter experts where you end up with a process. So, that I don't think we're paying per hour saved from a resilience perspective or anything like that deliberate, but we definitely talk a lot about it.
Caleb, anything else you've seen from your experience?
Yeah, and partially just watching Josh and watching their organization as an outsider looking in, it's a top to bottom effort. That it doesn't matter who I'm talking to in the organization, they can communicate that same vision and that same those same values and that same culture. So it's Josh is just as much aware of what's going on in his system as an engineer or somebody that's on the ground.
So going back to kind of the three things, the three phases you talked about, Caleb, the training, the mitigating avoidable work, and then minimizing damage. And then I think Josh added kind of this other element of learning from each storm and reincorporating from the beginning. Josh, Angie, or Caleb, can any of you talk to maybe more specifically to sharing any lessons you've learned from previous storms to incorporate into future response?
So I think one of the things to recognize is just frequency and the power of these different storms. This is no longer our 1,000-year flood plans are becoming 500-year. The 500 is 100, and the once every 100 year is every other year. So I think it's really important to review what happened in that last storm and setting up whether it's a town hall meeting to figure out what went well, what didn't go well. It's important to be working those into the capital plans.
Josh, Angie, anything to add? Any other specific, what you've learned from one storm that incorporated into future response to other storms to help you improve?
Sure, a very specific answer there. In one of our previous storms, post-storm, we looked at a line section and did a very deliberate analysis on that section. So how many times has it been out? How long? What does it cost us? What will it cost to mitigate? And we did that with an outside firm. A little bit costly, but we were able to justify a mitigation project, and we're able to feel really good about the investment being solid. So specifically, that was a river crossing where you're dealing with swift water, which is something you don't really work in, and we ended up doing a directional bore under that river. Extremely costly, and if we didn't have the really formal process, we would have been scared to tackle that. So I hope that's a good specific answer to that question.
Yeah, and have you seen that project, improve what you expected to do, improve the resiliency, or is that still undergoing the project?
The project's still underway, but it absolutely will. Yeah.
Okay. Angie, any specific examples from your perspective and your experience?
I guess one thing that comes to mind is situation with customers, it's a lateral, just customers at the end, but they're very vocal or, have some clout. And so when they get upset, I've seen utilities basically throw the kitchen sink at it, right? Everything but the kitchen sink. They'll have insulated conductors, they'll trim the trees, they'll put lateral reclosers with communications, everything they could to, improve reliability. I think it's difficult then to know the impact of each of those aspects because it's not a solution you can apply broadly across your system at that point then, because it is such a big investment. I can understand it being a difficult situation for utilities, having anchor customers and wanting to solve their problems. And so there's reasons to do that, but then at the same time, there's the downside of not knowing which aspect truly had the best benefit, kind of the biggest bang for the buck out of everything that was done in those situations. So I would say try to avoid that when possible.
So got it. So multiple solutions to a problem, you don't necessarily know what the right one is for scaling it across your grid. Another question, and I think this is something that probably each panelist could talk to just from their own perspectives, but from your perspectives, are utilities getting better at responding to storms, or has it been flat over the past 2 decades?
Definitely better. I think just in the questions at different presentations, just seeing where the different capital projects and how people are reinvesting in their grid, it's definitely gotten better.
Josh, your perspective?
Yeah, my perspective, haven't been here for 2 decades, but I'd say it's it's something that just in the last few years we have collaborated a lot, especially with our partners next to us, Duke Energy, and the systems are becoming very reliable.
Angie, your perspective?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, agree. We've seen an improvement, and I think the bar just keeps on getting raised up. More on that mentality of Josh saying they keep on reassessing and making sure improvements, and then you just keep going. Once you kind of get that momentum of seeing improvements in more resilient grid, you just keep building on that. So I've seen it really improve the last decade.
Another question that I think all 3 panelists could talk to is, you talked a little bit about Caleb, I think you mentioned this, 10-year storms coming down, that used to be 100-year storms. Now they're every 10 years or every other year. What time horizon do you think utilities should be looking at as far as trying to prepare their system for the types of events? I know Josh mentioned that there's tornadoes coming through. They were affected by a tornado, and that's more and more affecting different areas that traditionally may not have seen those types of events. Any idea of where utilities should start as far as the horizon they look for the types of events they should prepare for?
Well, we're almost to June, and that means hurricane season starting. So I would say probably last month. But realistically, some of it's going to be customer dependent, not for us, but the utilities customer. Right. So as we're seeing, there's a lot of examples out there where you can find where a storm response may have been in our world, maybe it was 3-4 days, and that sounds really good. But yet there's still open lawsuits against the utilities because specific municipalities or specific large industrial customers no longer find that acceptable. So I think part of it is going to just depend on the specific utility customer tolerance. But I really think a lot of this that we've been talking about is, if you're going to stay current and you're going to stay with the kind of the leading edge of utilities and where they're going, your storm resiliency plans need to be within the next 2 years is where you need to really be thinking.
Josh, you have something to add?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Caleb. The customer kind of engagement and their requirements are very visible now, and they're very engaged in the process. So, that drives the planning for sure. I think this is a tough question because it's almost, do we plan for these events that we think are going to be more frequent, and that could whipsaw you a little bit into making some investments that may not really pan out. So I would say the textbook risk management kind of ERP planning would be ideal. So what's the probability? What's going around the globe? What are people seeing? Really assign probabilities to it and keep yourself from going to any extreme.
Excellent. I think this one, for any of the panelists, you talked about training internally. Have you seen utilities do any sort of storm simulation to practice, or do you think that some utilities are facing enough storms every year that they get to practice through those?
I'll provide a couple of comments there. Didn't mean to talk over you, Caleb. Both. So our organization and most of the co-ops will do a tabletop type exercise where we'll think about the scenarios from 2 days out, 1 day out, a few hours out, and go through everybody's roles and responsibilities. But unfortunately, we get a lot of practice, and sometimes that serves as the kind of the planning tool.
Caleb, Angie, anything else to add to that?
Just speaking for the Southeast, most utilities, even if you are experiencing storms on an annual basis, they're still doing tabletop exercises, still going through some storm scenario responses and reviewing those. So it's probably a 6-month exercise once you include the actual events as well.
Okay. We got one question, I think for either Caleb or Josh, but you talked about the training for mutual aid, military, and the training the mutual aid teams responding to major storms. Can you repeat back what some of the best practices were for developing and implementing that training for mutual aid teams?
Yeah, I'll start and I'll let Josh add to it. So first part was creating some actual handout material, some sort of material, whether it's a laminated 8.5 by 11, even if it's an emergency contact card. But they need to know your system, your equipment, and your processes. So a laminated card with some of that information is one. Training videos was number 2. Making sure something that they can pull up on demand. Not everyone's going to remember everything that you gave them in a 1-hour welcome to our system presentation. So something that they can pull up when they're on day number 4, then exhausted, and as a refresher. And then the third part was just engaging manufacturers for that material. This shouldn't be material that you necessarily have to create on your own. A lot of this might already be created that you can just adapt for what you have.
Okay, thanks, Caleb. This is a very important one. So concerning mutual aid, I would say that having the mutual aid agreements in place is good because that covers things like pricing and hourly rates and that type of thing. But there are definitely very specific standards in place on the information that has to be shared between groups that work in mutual aid. So information sharing session and documentation with system voltages and the hazards and contact info, all those things are definitely required. You can look out, and you won't have to look too far to find those. And then having that define your program would be important.
Another question, you talked a lot about communicating internally into mutual aid groups about what your plan is. Can you talk about, do you communicate that to customers or stakeholders about what your plans are for storm response so that they understand that work's being done and improvements are being made?
I'll jump in here. We have a lot of customers. I think that is another excellent question because that is changing quickly. In the past, that has not been on the radar to share those plans and have some transparency there. Moving forward, that will be extremely important with a much more engaged customer base. So we have actually included that in our communication plan, what we'll talk about pre-storm. So we'll kind of show behind the curtain a little more than we have in the past. And that's based on some of the things we've seen in recent events, Facebook, social media type information that flows. It's a good time to get your customers engaged.
Yeah, I think we've been using that term level setting. And I think it's just as important for those customers. You have customers with expectations. It's good to get in front of them, to let them know what you're doing, and to kind of manage those expectations as well.
Okay. Last question, and this is for each of the panelists. Could you just kind of summarize, the biggest idea that you think our utility, both public power and investor owned, those customers, biggest idea you'd like to land with them from the topics you talked about in today's webinar? Caleb, you want to start?
Sure. So I think the biggest idea is that 70 to 90% of the work in storm resiliency is going to come from your pre-work. It's what you're doing up front to make sure that you're set up for when that storm hits, that you're ready and you can respond. So that means, mitigating avoidable damage, that training piece that we talked about, and then also making sure that you're using what resources you do have efficiently.
Angie?
Well, yeah, I called Caleb first. I was hoping I'd go.
Yeah, it's going to get increasingly hard. So I'm leaving Josh for the end.
I think, the biggest thing is really just the training. I'll build on that aspect really a bit more to make sure that the people are ready, and the safety aspect into that with the mutual aid crews coming in and not familiar with the system. We want to make sure everyone stays safe during major storms.
Josh?
Okay, the biggest one single idea, I would say at a very high level, what has gotten to this point as utilities, what has made us successful is extremely important. We're going to hold on to all of that information and experience, and the future is very much leveraged on technology, and we're going to be able to apply new things to the old things and end up with extremely reliable systems. So I would say that we should keep those things in mind as we move forward.
Awesome. Well, thank you all. And again, before we wrap up, that's all the time we have for questions, but I just want to remind everybody that we'll be sending a recording of this webinar to all those who attended today. In addition, when you leave the webinar, you'll be prompted with a 1-question survey on today's webinar. We would absolutely appreciate a few seconds of your time to complete the question before moving on to the rest of your day. And with that, I want to thank Angie, Caleb, and Josh for their time today. To all of our attendees, on behalf of S&C, thank you so much for your valuable time with us today, and be well and stay safe. Thank you.